They said Africa could only watch. They said Africa had no place in the great halls of diplomacy. Yet in May 2025, a voice rose from Ouagadougou that silenced skeptics from Washington to Brussels. A nation landlocked and often dismissed as powerless dared to challenge the world's oldest war, and the world was forced to listen. Ibrahim Traoré, at only 37 years of age, achieved what generations of mighty statesmen could not. He brought Israelis and Palestinians to the same table. He did not wield aircraft carriers or trillion-dollar budgets. He carried instead the memory of villages scarred by terrorism, the dignity of a continent long ignored, and the conviction that peace is born not from power, but from shared pain. For more than a decade, bombs had spoken louder than words in the Middle East. Then came a soldier from West Africa who asked a different question. If one landlocked nation can build a bridge across the deepest divide, what stops the rest of the world? Do not look away. This is more than a headline. Subscribe and stay with us, because what follows may change how you read the map. The war between Israel and Palestine had raged for decades, a cycle of rockets and retaliation that consumed the lives of ordinary people, while diplomats repeated the same tired scripts. Every major power had tried its hand at mediation. Washington, Brussels, even Moscow and Beijing. All had sent their envoys with lofty promises, only to leave behind deeper scars and unhealed wounds. By the spring of 2025, Gaza lay shattered once again, the West Bank seethed with despair, and the world resigned itself to another endless round of violence. Then on the 15th of May, from the capital of a small West African nation, came a declaration that stunned the world. Standing before his people in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré announced that Burkina Faso would host Middle East peace negotiations. His words cut through the cynicism of global politics. It is time for Africa to show the world what true leadership looks like. We who have suffered foreign interference and colonial violence understand both the pain of the oppressed and the fear of the besieged. The audacity was breathtaking. A country with no aircraft carriers, no veto power at the United Nations, no deep coffers of wealth, dared to step into the most intractable conflict of modern times. Western analysts dismissed it as posturing. Commentators in Tel Aviv scoffed at the idea that an African soldier could untangle what the world's most experienced diplomats had failed to resolve. The United States issued cautious warnings about unauthorized interventions. The European Union murmured skepticism about Africa's capacity to mediate. Yet in Ramallah, the reaction was different. Palestinian leaders welcomed any genuine initiative that might ease the suffering of their people. To them, Burkina Faso's lack of historical baggage was not weakness. It was strength. For decades, Palestinians had been weighed down by mediators whose own colonial shadows distorted the playing field. An African nation, itself scarred by imperial interference, offered something different: empathy without manipulation. Traoré understood this advantage. His strategy, according to observers, was built upon three pillars. First, the moral authority of a continent that had largely stood apart from the Middle East conflict. Second, his own personal credibility, forged in the harsh battles against terrorism in the Sahel. And third, the diplomatic umbrella of new partnerships with Russia and China, who were prepared to shield his initiative from Western obstruction. He was not naive. He knew the world would laugh at the notion of an African solution to a Middle Eastern war, but he also knew that laughter could not bury truth. Burkina Faso's history was one of wounds, yes, but also of resilience. If his land could endure colonization, poverty, and terror, then surely it could offer wisdom about reconciliation. And so the seed was planted. Like a small grain of millet dropped into the dry Sahel soil, fragile yet alive, his declaration began to germinate. Few believed it could grow. But in the dusty winds of doubt, something extraordinary was about to take root. They mocked him as naive, yet within 2 weeks the world would be forced to witness the impossible. By the 29th of May, skepticism began to falter. Against every prediction, delegations from Israel and Palestine agreed to preliminary talks in Amman, Jordan. The news rippled through diplomatic circles like thunder in a clear sky. Commentators who had mocked Traoré's audacity now scrambled to explain how an African soldier had brought two bitter enemies to the same table. The conference hall in Amman was heavily fortified. Soldiers guarded the perimeter, intelligence services scanned every corner. Yet inside, a different kind of security was being built. Ibrahim Traoré did not arrive as a conqueror or as a supplicant. He came as a storyteller. On the very first day, he spoke not of treaties or technicalities, but of Burkina Faso's scars. He told them of villages burned by terrorists, of children buried in shallow graves, of mothers whose wails echoed through Sahel nights. His voice did not waver as he declared, "This pain knows no nationality, no religion, no politics. The tears of a Palestinian mother taste the same as the tears of an Israeli mother. The blood of your children is the same red as the blood of children in Burkina Faso." Silence followed. For a moment, hardened negotiators forgot their talking points. They saw not an adversary across the table, but a mirror reflecting their own grief. Palestinian delegate Barakat later confessed, "Captain Traoré spoke to our hearts, not our politics. For the first time in years, someone understood our pain without taking sides." Over the next days, his method unfolded like a carefully composed symphony. Days 1 to 3 were devoted to personal storytelling. Israelis and Palestinians, long accustomed to shouting past each other, were invited simply to listen. No interruptions, no rebuttals, just testimony of suffering. Days 4 to 7 opened joint sessions where historical traumas were laid bare. Centuries of bitterness, siege, and exile were voiced, but this time in a forum that demanded listening, not retaliation. By the second week, the focus shifted. Humanitarian needs came first. Corridors for aid, guarantees for medical access, exchanges of prisoners. These were not abstract ideals but urgent lifelines. Traoré anchored every proposal in practical reality, insisting that dignity began with food, medicine, and safety for children. On the 15th of June, the impossible happened. Under the watchful eyes of African Union mediators, and with international guarantees from Russia and China, both sides signed the Amman Accords. 14 days of ceasefire were agreed, along with humanitarian corridors supervised by African peacekeepers, prisoner exchanges facilitated by neutral mediators, and international monitoring. The world staggered in disbelief. Western newspapers called it the Amman miracle. In Ramallah, crowds cheered at the first trucks of aid passing unmolested. In Tel Aviv, families spoke cautiously of hope, even as they wondered how long it might last. Across Africa, celebrations erupted. For the first time in living memory, the continent had not only contributed to global diplomacy, it had led it. But not everyone rejoiced. In Washington, whispers began that African initiatives threatened to undermine established influence. European capitals fretted about the precedent. If Africa could solve the Middle East, what else might it claim the right to resolve? Behind the public statements of polite applause, darker calculations were being drawn. As the ink dried on the Amman Accords, shadows gathered. For there were those who would rather see blood flow than allow Africa's voice to rise. Barely 5 days after the signing of the Amman Accords, the storm broke. Intelligence leaks revealed that Western agencies had allocated millions to sabotage the fragile peace. Reports spoke of disinformation campaigns portraying Traoré as an Iranian puppet, financial pressure on Jordan to withdraw support, and even covert funding of opposition voices within Africa to undermine his credibility. What had begun as whispers of skepticism hardened into a systematic effort to drown the African voice. On the 25th of June, sabotage turned violent. As Traoré's convoy drove through Tel Aviv, gunfire erupted. Precision sniper rounds shattered the windshields, killing Lieutenant Kabore, his most trusted aide, and wounding Traoré in the shoulder. Forensics later traced the rifles to Western suppliers, fueling speculation that the attack bore the signature of professional special forces. Traoré's response was as defiant as it was heartbreaking. Standing before cameras, arm-bound in white bandages, he declared, "They killed my friend to stop peace. His blood will not be wasted. The ceasefire will hold." His words echoed across continents. What was meant to silence him only magnified his moral authority. The assassination attempt transformed him from negotiator into martyr in waiting. International sympathy poured in. Palestinians and Israelis alike condemned the violence against the mediator. The African Union convened an emergency session, pledging collective protection for Burkina Faso's mission. Russia and China dispatched security advisors to reinforce his safety. Back home, grief mingled with pride. Lieutenant Kabore's funeral in Ouagadougou drew thousands, with mourners chanting that his sacrifice had sown the seed of peace. In the streets, murals began to appear, Kabore's face beside the word "Martyr of Amman." Traoré himself was no longer seen merely as the young officer who had seized power in his homeland. He had become the symbol of what many began to call the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not just a domestic upheaval, but the moment Africa seized the stage of world diplomacy. The political ripple effects were immense. In Africa, leaders from South Africa to Kenya hailed him as proof that the continent could offer solutions rather than dependency. Across the Middle East, the idea that Africa, so often dismissed as peripheral, could broker peace forced a recalibration of alliances. Even in Western capitals, however grudging, officials admitted privately that the African-led ceasefire had lasted longer than any recent initiative under their sponsorship. Civilian life, too, bore witness to the consequences. In Gaza, aid convoys entered without bombardment for the first time in years. Hospitals reported supplies reaching them without interruption. Israeli towns near the border recorded weeks without the sound of sirens. Families on both sides began to imagine futures where their children might grow up without learning the rhythm of war. Yet beneath the fragile calm, the world remained tense. Traore's survival symbolized hope, but also provoked fear in those who felt their influence slipping. Was this truly the dawn of a new diplomatic order, or a brief interlude before old powers reclaimed the stage? They thought the bullet would end his mission. Instead, it ignited a fire that no intelligence agency could extinguish. The Amman Accords did more than pause rockets and airstrikes. They redrew the map of credibility. For decades, the mantle of peacemaker had belonged to Washington, Brussels, or the Vatican. Suddenly, the headlines bore a new phrase: Africa, the mediator. Across the continent, leaders were quick to embrace the shift. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa declared, "Captain Traore has restored Africa's place at the global table. We are no longer beggars for solutions. We are providers of wisdom." From Nairobi, Uhuru Kenyatta hailed him as the proof that Africa could solve not only its own problems, but the world's. In Addis Ababa, the African Union chairperson, Moussa Faki, called the Accords the dawn of African diplomatic leadership. Internationally, recognition flowed in. The United Nations Secretary General praised African innovation in diplomacy. Scholars from 147 institutions nominated Traore for the Nobel Peace Prize. The Vatican extended a private invitation to meet Pope Francis, while conferences across Europe and Asia began dissecting what journalists dubbed the Ouagadougou method. Yet the ripples spread beyond accolades. Russia and China deepened their support, offering security for African mediators and funding new peace infrastructure. Turkey and Iran acknowledged Africa's diplomatic authority. Even reluctant Western powers, rattled by the symbolism, began recalibrating. Washington quietly increased budgets for African diplomatic engagement. Paris floated partnerships and peace initiatives. London proposed coordination on mediation frameworks. Commentators described the shift as nothing less than a Burkina Faso revolution in diplomacy. A small, landlocked country, once synonymous with poverty and instability, had become the axis of a new geopolitical narrative. If Ouagadougou could bring calm to Gaza, why could Lagos not influence Khartoum? Why could Nairobi not weigh in on Kyiv? The precedent had been set. African voices mattered, not as passive recipients of aid, but as active architects of peace. Still, questions lingered. Could the fragile ceasefire withstand the pressures of history? Could Africa's diplomatic renaissance avoid being smothered by the same powers who felt threatened by its rise? The answers remained uncertain, but one truth had crystallized. The world could no longer dismiss African wisdom as irrelevant. If one small nation could tilt the balance in the Middle East, what greater role might Africa claim in the storms yet to come? By September 2025, the Amman Accords had held for over 4 months, the longest uninterrupted calm between Israel and Palestine in more than a decade. Aid convoys moved through African-supervised corridors. Medical evacuations were carried out without obstruction. Schools in Gaza began reconstruction with African technical assistance, while Israeli and Palestinian farmers launched small but symbolic joint projects. What had begun as an audacious gamble was now producing tangible results. The success triggered a wave of new demands for African mediation. Ukraine, weary of stalled negotiations with Western powers, quietly requested African involvement in talks with Russia. Ethiopia and Eritrea looked to Ouagadougou for help in calming border disputes. Mali and Algeria raised the prospect of African Union facilitation for their tensions, while Sudan and Chad sought AU-backed mediation to prevent regional escalation. This momentum birthed something unprecedented: the creation of the African Peace Institute in Ouagadougou. Not merely a symbolic monument, it was envisioned as a center for training mediators, documenting African traditions of conflict resolution, and exporting the continent's diplomatic expertise. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not importing frameworks of peace, it was exporting them. Yet Traore's vision was not simply institutional, it was philosophical. He argued that diplomacy must move beyond interests and leverage, towards shared humanity and collective healing. Drawing from Ubuntu, I am because we are, and the palaver tradition of extended dialogue, he sought to transform global negotiations into spaces where pain was acknowledged, not suppressed. For Africa, the implications were profound. The continent, long branded as a battlefield for others' wars, was beginning to define itself as a workshop of peace. Nations from Nigeria to Kenya explored their own mediation initiatives inspired by the Burkina Faso precedent. Across the diaspora, young Africans spoke of dignity and sovereignty, no longer content with the role of recipient, but aspiring to be providers of solutions. Still, the road ahead was fraught. Could the fragile architecture of African diplomacy withstand geopolitical sabotage? Could resources be mobilized to sustain mediation across multiple conflicts? Would the unity of the African Union hold under the weight of great power rivalry? These were open questions, but one truth glimmered. The seed had been planted. The soil was African. The harvest might be global. If a grain of hope from Burkina Faso could germinate peace in the Middle East, who can deny that Africa may one day reap a harvest that heals the world? In a world where diplomacy had grown weary and cynical, a young soldier from West Africa reminded us of something elemental. Peace is not forged by power alone, but by the courage to recognize shared humanity. Ibrahim Traoré's journey, from the dusty streets of Ouagadougou to the guarded halls of Amman, was more than a diplomatic mission. It was a declaration that Africa's time had come. The Amman Accords proved that the voices long dismissed as peripheral could chart a path where superpowers had stumbled. For Palestinians and Israelis, it meant food reaching the hungry, hospitals supplied, and a reprieve from funerals. For Africans, it meant dignity, the knowledge that their soil, scarred by colonization and conflict, could also nurture solutions that heal others. This is why many now speak of the Burkina Faso revolution in diplomacy. It was not a coup of guns and power, but of ideas and moral authority. Yet it is also inseparable from the Ibrahim Traoré coup. For the man who once seized control of his homeland has now seized the world's imagination. What began as a domestic upheaval has blossomed into a continental awakening. The road ahead is uncertain. Old powers will resist, sabotage will return, and peace will always be fragile. But the precedent has been set. Africa is no longer only a stage for other actors. It is a voice, a mediator, a leader. Brothers and sisters across continents, ask yourself, if a single landlocked nation could tilt the balance of one of history's deepest divides, what might an entire continent achieve if united in purpose? Stay with us, because the story of Africa's diplomatic rise is far from over. Share this journey, add your voice in the comments, and subscribe so that together we continue to witness history unfold.